Well, good afternoon and a welcome to our guests to one of our regular series of forums by visiting scholars at Monticello. My name is Andrew O'Shaughnessy. I'm the Sanders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome Jean-Baptiste Goyard, who is currently teaching at the University of Versailles and finishing a doctorate at the University of Paris 8 in France. His topic today is the American Revolution and the Ancient World. I told him I'm particularly excited hosting this because I'm going to be taking notes, not least because I'm hosting a voyage with the University of Virginia from Athens to Istanbul at the beginning of September, in which we're going to be focusing not only on the history of the ancient world, but also the influence of classical thought and models on the founding generation in the United States. It's called the origins of the democratic ideal. But let's first hear from the real expert whose subject this is, Jean-Baptiste Goyard. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And I first would like to express my thanks to the International Center for Jefferson Studies, to the staff of the library there, to the staff around at Kenwood, and to the other fellows who have made my stay even more enjoyable. I must say it's been a very happy cast. I have highly appreciated this fellowship after almost 2 years of academic shutdown due to COVID, and I sincerely thank everyone who has made it possible. As you have just stated, I am doing my PhD on the reference to antiquity in the American Revolution. That is to say, from roughly the mid-1750s to the beginning of the 1790s, at the crossing of the history of representations and of the history of ideas. I particularly study the references to ancient political models and counter-models in that period. And today, I'd like to focus on the use and even on the manipulation sometimes of the history of a few Greek leagues during the creation of the Confederation and the debate on the Constitution, a theme that covers 2 chapters of my dissertation chronologically. We could maybe start with, if I can get it right, can you see my PowerPoint? I hope so. We could maybe start with a famous neoclassical representation of the ratification of the Constitution in the form of a neoclassical metaphor by Benjamin Russell, the printer of the Massachusetts Sentinel, published in January 1788, that is to say, during the ratification process. This famous piece of iconography shows the Constitution as being ratified, and it shows that the new US institutions are being erected like the pillars of a temple, 5 pillars so far, the 6th being Massachusetts. I always find it interesting to visualize intellectual phenomena here through an engraving. And it's just an example, among many others, of the classical or neoclassical conditioning of the Americans in the second half of the 18th century. All the Americans were not steeped in the classics. Some founders, like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, were definitely experienced classicists, but not the majority of the population. However, many American colonists were imbued with antiquity. They were surrounded by the ancient world.
Oh, John, I'm sorry, can I stop you just for a second? We actually do not see your PowerPoint. Do you mind trying to share that?
Right, let's try to share it better then. Can you see it now?
Yes, and then if you just want to hit like, yep, starting from there, that'd be awesome on the top left there. And now we see it. Yes, we're all good. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. So yes, as I was saying, many Americans were surrounded by the ancient world in newspapers and periodicals. Articles published in those media ranged from serious writings, for example, excerpts from pamphlets, to patriotic poems and odes, but also to humorous and satirical pieces. For example, if you search the word Greece in the American magazines, in the ProQuest database here, you will find references to Greece in plans to produce silk in New England, in articles about the origins of corn, on beekeeping, in case anyone is interested in the audience, on medicine, for example, curing gout, on the invention of writing, on taste, on ingratitude, examples of ingratitude in Greece and Rome, in this case, on civilization, whether a rude or a civilized state of society is most favorable to poetical composition, in this case, on courting, as well as riddles, among other subjects. It is true that periodicals tended to be more literary than newspapers, but there were also poems in newspapers and ads proving that neoclassical names were also given to horses and, unfortunately, to slaves in the case of runaway ads, problematic as it may seem and is definitely to us nowadays. So I think it's important to bear this neoclassical environment in mind as we study their potential influence, the potential influence of classical references of the 1770s and 1780s. This period marked a founding moment in the history of the young American Republic, a moment which was at some point a neo-Greek moment. And the American colonists started referring to Greek leagues and to a Greek league in particular, known as the Anfichionic League, before declaring independence. After gaining its independence, the young nation set up its first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, and the Americans kept referring to this league as well as to others in the following years. The nation then decided to abandon the Articles of Confederation for the Federal Constitution, ratified in 1788. From the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, the USA questioned its federal system towards more centralization. On this federal path, some founders of the Republic turned back to antiquity, particularly to ancient Greece, which had witnessed the rise and fall of several confederations and city-states in history, in order to investigate on the causes of their fall. So what I'd like to do today is to give a quick view of the historiography of the classical tradition in that period, to present three Greek leagues in particular that have been slightly disregarded by the historiography, to present my methodology, to give a chronological overview of some of the neoclassical references to antiquity during the period covered by my dissertation, and finally, to show a case study of the references to the Greek leagues, thanks to a few keyword searches made during the creation of the Confederation, or on the creation of the Confederation and on the debate on the Constitution, as well as a few examples of Federalist contradictions on the reference to the Greek leagues, and a few examples of anti-Federalist consistent examples on the same leagues. So if we have a look at the historiography of the subject, this field is of course related to the classical tradition, which has been partly studied by major historians, for example, Gilbert Chinard on Thomas Jefferson at the beginning of the 20th century, but also later in the 20th century by Mayor Reynolds, John Eadie, William Ziobro at the turn of the 21st, and more recently, Caroline Winterer on the culture of classicism and more particularly on its relation with gender at the turn of the 19th century, by Aaron Shalev as well, who has looked at the chronological evolution of the representation of Rome during the 7 Years' War and before and after the Stamp Act, and by Nicholas Cole, amongst others, who has focused on political science and on the instrumental use of the classics in the passage from British constitutional thought to modern American Republican thought. Now, one great historian has made a lasting judgment on the limited influence of the classics during the American Revolution. It's, of course, Bernard Bailyn, who in 1967 made a lasting and stimulated judgment, still interesting almost 60 years later, by saying that in his ideological origins of the American Revolution, the classics were but window dressing in the revolutionary rhetoric of the Americans. He explained that the classics were everywhere in the literature of the revolution, but everywhere illustrative, not determinative of thought, that they were not the source of political and social beliefs. What he meant by determinative is not entirely clear, hence the need to investigate the role of the classics. What did the revolutionaries and the founders refer to when they used classical references, when and why? And in addition to this, to what extent does the study of neoclassical references help question historiographical interpretations on the American Revolution? Now, we should have a look at three leagues that we're going to talk about together that were mentioned by the founders of the American Republic. First of all, there's what they called the Anfichionic League, which in fact was the Delphic Anfichiony, founded in the 5th century BC. And it was a religious and military alliance composed of 12 tribes whose representatives met in council with equal voting powers. And it has been described by Dionysius, Aeschines in his orations, Strabo in his geography, Plutarch in his life of Themistocles. The second league, which comes second in chronologically and in number of occurrences, is the Akian League. There were two Akian Leagues, in fact, and the second one, created in the 3rd century BC, was the one that was most interesting to the founders, because its members were all democratic, because they had a common system of weights and measures, as well as common officers and judges and a common council. And their source on the Akian League was primarily Polybius in his histories, and Plutarch in his life of Aratus. Now, the third one was the Lycian League, founded in the 1st century BC, and it was a federal league formed, which was praised by the Federalists in particular because of its proportional voting system in a confederal or federal assembly, a representative assembly. And it was described by Strabo in his geography. Now, how have those leagues been treated by the historiography? First of all, the references to Greece have been much less studied than the references to Rome, especially before 1787. Secondly, newspapers and periodicals have not been studied thoroughly either regarding the classical tradition. And thirdly, when the Greek leagues have been studied, it was in studies focusing on the drafting and ratification of the Constitution, and rather teleologically. That is to say, in order to illustrate the victory or explain the victory of the Federalists over the Anti-Federalists. So there are a few studies on the classical references in the Federalist Papers, for example, and Carl Richard has also studied the leagues, but in a light rather favorable to the Federalists. For example, he contends that the anti-Federalists' reply was to use the leagues, reply to the use of the leagues by the Federalists, was to rest mostly on Montesquieu's axiom on the requisite small size of the republics. So let's see how the references to the Greek leagues fit in Bernard Bailyn's judgment on the illustrative and limited influence of the classics. Among the various questions that we can ask about those leagues, it may be wondered who referred to those leagues, when, where, why, and how it enlightens the founding. We may also wonder how the study of those leagues also enabled me, in particular, to question my own approach as a historian. We may wonder in passing whether ancient experience could be more useful than modern experience on certain points, whether some precedents were exclusively neoclassical, whether ancient experience could be felt as necessary by some founders, whether some of them whether some founders actually made contradictions, there we go, themselves on the utility of the classics, and whether there could be a determinative influence of neoclassicism on the psychology of the revolutionaries or on their social, political, and philosophical conceptions. We may, in addition to that, discuss the general tendency to overlook the Confederation teleologically and to present it as doomed to fail, the tendency to underplay the use of neoclassical references by the anti-federalists, and the tendency to associate exceptionalism exclusively with Puritanism. And I will occasionally talk of a neoclassical exceptionalism in Britain in particular. So all in all, my contention is quite simple. It is that the references to antiquity are chronological, that they reflect the political chronology of the founding of the US, and that those references were more useful or influential than what Bernard Bailyn has claimed, particularly psychologically, philosophically, and on the way the founders perceived the world. Now, regarding my methodology, I try to act as a historian and therefore to collect facts and to try to explain them. The history of representations and of ideas is first of all about history and therefore chronology. So I try to resist the temptation to apply an idea valid at some time to another period, anachronistically or teleologically. I primarily study representations rather than the intellectual or philosophical classical inheritance of the founders, but they are of course related. And when I made a chronology of those references, at least references to major political models and counter models, I tried to do it on both sides of the Atlantic in a comparative approach, so as to see whether there was a common neoclassical heritage in Britain and in colonial America, whether there could be American characteristics as well, and if so, if their role could be assessed in the revolution. For example, do neoclassical references support the claim that Whig radicalism was more developed or dominant in America? How to do so? Well, through quantification, so keyword searches related to specific models and counter models in America and in Britain, but also through a qualitative approach as well, since all the results are checked individually to make sure the keyword searches are reliable. Now, I am, of course, perfectly aware that we definitely have to be careful about the quantification of terms in digitized sources in particular, and I'll get back to this later. The influence of ideas is not necessarily proportional to those occurrences that we find. Nevertheless, some of my observations, I should say most of my observations, are clear-cut, and the results concur in various types of sources, digitized and transcribed, private and published. So which sources do I work on? I wanted to show you this very quick slide about, let's say, the types of results and false results that we can find in those keyword searches. So in this case, looking for the word Akian, we find Astrakhan, for example, in 3 hits, and only Akian in the 4th result in the early American newspaper. That was done in 2012, and it's worth mentioning since we'll get back to it later. Now, I can also show you a small overview of the way I work. So I have my list of keywords on the left with different spellings, and I then indicate the number of hits minus the number of irrelevant hits, like Astrakhan, in order to get the total of relevant hits and then to sort out which ones actually refer to the leagues or not. I also indicate the date when I make the keyword searches in order to be able to track my own, let's say, archives. And if we look at the period, let's say, that interests us the most, so in the 1780s here, we can see what it looks like. Now, to get back to the sources, I use, let's say, the most common sources on the colonial era and the later periods, the early American newspapers, both early American newspapers and British newspapers, there we go, American periodicals and British periodicals, Rotunda's American founding era, on the Confederation, the journals of the Continental Congress, the letters of the delegates to Congress, John Adams's defense of the Constitution, Madison's notes on ancient and modern confederacies, Hamilton's Continentalist essays or series, on the drafting of the constitutions, the records of the Federal Convention, and on the ratification, the great documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution, and Jonathan Elliott's debates in the several states conventions. Now, my work at Monticello has enabled me to study sources not available in France, for example, American magazines, which I only had in paper version, in fact, to confirm keyword searches in American newspapers and in British newspapers, and also to actually extend the scope of my research, thanks to other collections, like collections on the British press in the British Empire, including India and the Caribbean. We can have a look now at the main stages of Neo-Roman and then Neo-Greek references chronologically. What you can see on this slide here is that the middle of the 18th century was mainly dominated by Neo-Roman rather than Neo-Greek references, both in Britain and in America. You can see that before the 7 Years' War, Britain tended to be associated with Rome in a laudatory way, at first by being associated with the Roman Republic, and that after the major British victories of the 7 Years' War, it was associated with the Roman Empire. So before the 7 Years' War, terms that we associate now with republicanism, such as virtue, were made compatible with monarchy thanks to those ancient references. And we can see that towards the end of the 70s, where there was a praise of the neo-glorious, neo-Roman British Empire in Britain and America. The idea that there was a translatio imperii, transferring power and world hegemony, neo-Roman world hegemony to Britain. And we can even see in this quotation, this excerpt by Arthur Young, an example of neoclassical exceptionalism regarding America and Britain. You can see that he compared the dimensions of Britain's empire with that of Persia or Rome or China, and he concluded that it was much bigger than those empires, and that the seeds, in spite of this, the seeds of decay, which were sown in the very formation of ancient empires, will have no existence here. What is interesting here is that it was a mere footnote, and that this footnote was extensively published in America, while it was not published in any British periodical, to my knowledge. I've checked in the Burney collection and in the 18th century journals portal, which is highly reliable. However, it was published in at least 4 American newspapers in 1772, and we can even see that it was republished in 1787, at the time, therefore, I should say just before the drafting of the Confederation, 5 times, at least 5 times. So what does it suggest? It suggests that the huge size of the American colonies was not perceived as a problem yet, and that there was a neoclassical exceptionalism regarding America in Britain, which was republished in America. As Aaron Shalev has pointed out, this laudatory vision of the Roman Republic and then Empire was replaced by a critical association of Britain with the corrupt Roman Republic and Empire at the time of the Stamp Act crisis. We may even speak of a paranoid association in some cases. As we can see in the first quotation here, Abigail Adams thus wrote to her friend Mercy Otis Warren a few weeks before the battles of Lexington and Concord. "The die is cast, infatuated Britain, poor distressed America. Heaven only knows what is next to take place, but it seems to me the sword is now our only, yet dreadful, alternative, and the fate of Rome will be renewed in Britain." So it shows that the neoclassical readings of the founders also had an influence on their psychology and on the way they perceived the events through a neoclassical prism. This critical and fearful association of Britain with corrupt Rome should not overshadow, however, a wave of neoclassical patriotism, even optimism, which followed during and after the War of Independence. For example, here, that's the second point, a procession which was organized to celebrate the first anniversary of the Franco-American military alliance between France, and America was clearly represented as a rising empire replacing Britain. There were 13 arches in this procession, and the 4th one represented Britain as a decaying empire, comparing it with Achaia, Rome, and Egypt. The 5th one represented America as a rising empire. The 7th one read Nil Disperandum Republicae, do not despair in the Republic. And the 12th one represented American heroes who had died in the field, extolled by the Republican heroes, Brutus and Cato, for struggling against tyranny. And the last one showed peace, displaying an olive branch and emblems of an extensive empire. Of course, America. So the procession referred both to Greek and Roman antiquity to support the rise of a new republican American empire. It's this period also paved the way to a new and fearless stage regarding neoclassical patriotism, as we can see in the references to the Greek leagues. So we can have a look at the censuses I made of those leagues in the early American newspaper series, and we can see that there was a small interest in the Anfichionic League, the red line here, in the middle of the 1770s, and a bigger peak, a higher peak at the time of the Constitution in 1787. This database, this census was made on the leagues, not on the regions, precisely. So there's clearly a chronology here of classical references to the leagues. The articles about the Greek leagues were not published before the mid-1770s, so before the Confederation, in fact. And we can see a strong correlation between the debate on the Confederation and then on the Constitution and its leagues. This observation is confirmed by the same searches made in the papers of the Founding Fathers. You can see again the same rise of interest in the mid-70s and a peak in the 1780s. At the time of the Constitution, of the debate on the Constitution. So what those leagues are, what those graphs suggest is therefore that it was the first time in American history that, and in British American history, that the American colonists referred to those leagues, since the papers that I had a look at start in, the collection starts in 1690. And we can have a look at a similar search I made in Britain for the sake of comparison. And what we get in Britain is almost no result. In fact, I have not updated this graph, but the keyword searches I made here about British newspapers in Monticello suggest that there was another occurrence later in the 1790s as well. So what we can say, therefore, is that there are four conclusions to be drawn from this. First, a correlation between the references to the Anfichionic League and the founding of the Confederation. The second one, stronger one, between references to those three leagues and the debate on the Constitution. And thirdly, that it was the first time that in American history that the Americans referred to those leagues. Now there's a fourth conclusion, which is that it was an American characteristic in the English-speaking world. Now we can have a look at the nature of those references. They were at first generic, monarchical, and loyal. That's what we can see, for example, in a quotation by John Adams, who wrote about the Grecian Commonwealths in the plural as the most heroic confederacy in the singular in 1774, so before the start of the war, without specifying any precise league in particular. Then another letter by Mercy Otis Warren suggests that those references became more specific as the American Revolution went on. She mentioned that she hoped that the present period would leave one to posterity, and that the one, that is to say, a Commonwealth, a perfect Commonwealth, and that the American Republic would come as near the standard of perfection as the state of humanity will admit, and that listening to the dictates of common sense, Paine's pamphlet, the Anfichionic body will not be obliged to yield to the violence of party. And what is interesting here is this simile, Anfichionic body, used instead of Continental Congress, which suggests, again, that the prism of Greek confederalism was important for the revolutionaries, since the term Anfichionic was used as a synonym of federal or confederal nowadays. So both quotations suggest that some neoclassical references could be more useful than modern references on certain points like republicanism or federalism. Now this hopeful association of the Continental Congress with the Anfichionic Council turned into real, and I could almost say naive, optimism in the following months of the year 1776. If we look at an article written by J.R., nothing to do with Dallas, we can see that this unknown or this anonymous writer advocated the establishment of a confederation before the Declaration of Independence, as he termed it, by referring to the Anfichionic League. He explained that Anfichion, the founder, the mythical founder of the League, had proposed a mutual confederation, offensive and defensive, to the Greeks, and thereby united them in one body, which put an end to their destroying each other, rendered them powerful and peaceable at home, and formidable abroad. He also added that each state was left in full possession of all their former laws, privileges, and powers of government, with authority to regulate its internal police, which may be, let's say, a nice anticipation of what the Articles of Confederation would be in the following years. Finally, he stated that this confederation was the solution for the US, for the American colonies and states, since it would secure against falling to pieces and was the best safeguard or guard against the seeds of discord and corruption, in a way which echoes, let's say, Arthur Young's exceptionalist comments of 1772. So this enthusiasm, triggered by the creation of the Confederation and developed by it, is teleologically overshadowed by the troubles of the Confederation in the following years. We are more familiar with this, so I'll be quite quick about it, but for example, Alexander Hamilton stated that the Anfichionic Council did not have enough weight to preserve effectually the balance and harmony of the Confederacy. Another example dates back to March 1783, when the Newburgh conspiracy gave Abigail Adams a new ground for concern. She feared lest another Theseus may arise, who by his reputation and exploits of valor, whose personal character and universal popularity may destroy our Amphictyonic system and subjugate our infant republics to monarchical domination. Again, we can see the reference to Amphictyonic, if I quote, as a synonym of federal or confederal and the prism of the Greek leagues. Now, another example is, of course, the debate on the Constitution and on its ratification, which offered a striking, let's say, opportunity for the delegates to identify the causes which had triggered the downfall of ancient confederations, to devise safeguards to preserve the great American Republic from them, but also to manipulate them according to their political sympathies. So if we have a look at a similar keyword search made in the three leagues in the US newspapers during the ratification, we can see at the bottom that the great majority of the articles were published, 61 articles, by Federalists. I again should update this table thanks to occurrences that I've found at Monticello recently. The same goes in the debate on the Constitution during the drafting of the Constitution. That's the following slide here, with 9 interventions in total about the 3 league leagues, or one of those leagues, 8 Federalists, 1 anti-Federalist only. And in the state ratifications, state ratification conventions, here 21 interventions in total, 18 made by Federalists and 3 by anti-Federalists. It could be explained by the fact that most of the interventions published were made by Federalists rather than anti-Federalists in the press. Now, does this quantitative domination of the Federalists, since about 80% of them are Federalists, made by Federalists, necessarily imply a qualitative superiority of the arguments? If we have a look at James Wilson's use of those leagues, we can say that he contradicted himself. In the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, he stated in November 1787, and we can remember this date, that those leagues, or the information about them, were too vague and imperfect, and therefore that they must be considered rather as subjects of curiosity than of use or information, in a way which is reminiscent of Bernard Berlin's claim. However, when we look at what he said during the Federal Convention, he was the first one, actually, the first delegate to mention the Anfichionic League on the 6th of June, 1787, to prove that the states were more likely to encroach on the central power than the reverse. It was a typically Federalist treatment of the leagues, of course. Now, a few weeks after his claim in the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, he also stated, still in this convention, that the Lycian Republic was an association, and I should move to the following slide, was an association of 23 towns, the large ones having 3 votes in the Common Council, the middling ones 2, and the small towns 1. So he did refer to this league in spite of his claim that they did not provide enough information. It was very hard indeed to refrain from using the leagues. Why did Wilson end up referring the Lycian League on proportional representation? We can see that James Madison made a similar reference to it in his notes, and not anywhere in his notes on ancient and modern confederacies. He stated that in this confederacy, the number of votes allotted to each member was proportioned to its pecuniary contributions, and not anywhere in the notes, as I was saying, since it's the very first page of the notes, on the very first line of the page. And my suggestion, after reading all the notes, is that Lycia was in fact the only example of proportional representation in a federal representative assembly. There's no other example in these notes. So in some ways, the founders, if this is correct, the founders were, let's say that Lycia was the exclusively, the only precedent of proportional representation in a proportional, in a representative assembly. We may note in passing, of course, Madison's proactive attitude when he wrote his notes in order to devise a new constitution, or to reform it, at least. In addition to that, Madison also manipulated the Lycean League. Indeed, he confessed in private to Jefferson, that's the first quotation, that little was known on the Lycean Confederacy in October 1787, but he asserted publicly that all the examples of ancient and modern confederacies, without any exception, then supported this point on the encroachment of the states over the central government that was made 3 months later in Federalist 45. And we can also see that at the bottom of this quotation, he admitted in a very complex and contrived way the existence of an inference made regarding those leagues. In other words, we could draw lessons for the US Constitution thanks to those leagues, in spite of the difference in time, of course. So as for James Wilson, it looked very difficult not to refer to those leagues for Madison. Now, conversely, we may have a look at a few examples of anti-federalist references to those leagues. For example, James Monroe's reference to the Anfichionic League. One of their arguments was that the Anfichionic League had fallen because its members could ask for foreign aid. So logically, one of the suggestions was that the prohibition of contracting alliances designed by the Articles of Confederation was enough to preclude the risk of a similar risk, let's say, in the USA. And that's what Federal Farmer said at the bottom of the quotation. Each member possessed power to league itself with foreign powers. Another argument was that the US states were all Republican as in the Akian League. And that's the following slide. James Monroe, therefore, insisted on the fact that those Akian states were in perfect harmony and friendship. Of course, a reference to the League of Friendship designed by the Articles of Confederation. The anti-federalist point on this league in particular was that external causes were to be blamed for the fall of the league. As he mentioned, James Monroe still, there was no internal dissension or dissensions according to him. They were surrounded by great and powerful nations, the Aetolians and the Lacedaemonians in this case, which had incited them to ask for assistance to Macedon, who then conquered the League. What did the Federalists say on those points? We can see, I'm going to be quite synthetic about this. I know it's not very legible, sorry about it, that Dickinson, as Fabius, agreed on external causes as the main reason for the fall of the Akian League. And he contradicted himself on the presence of monarchical and aristocratical factions at home, which may have led to the fall of the League as well. In the first quotation, he said that there were the Achaeans had not established monarchy and aristocracy. And in the second quotation, that there were inveterately monarchical and aristocratic factions. And the last quotation by Fabius suggests that the Akian League was conquered by Rome because of its success, since Rome was jealous of the Achaeans. So it's not really let's say, a problem, an internal problem identified here. What about Publius? Well, Publius in the Federalist also contradicted itself after suggesting that there were no internal causes at first. He stated, that was Madison and Hamilton here, they stated, "We are not to conclude too hastily, however, that faction did not, in a certain degree, agitate the particular cities." However, they did reach the traditional Federalist conclusion that the Akian League emphatically illustrated the tendency of federal bodies rather to anarchy among the members than to tyranny in the head. Now, the last slide I'd like to show you is a slide about, let's say, the feeling of necessity that some founders may have had regarding those leagues. It's a quotation of a letter by Christopher Gore to Rufus King, when Christopher Gore had just been elected as delegate to the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. And in this letter, he referred to the fact that Rufus King had talked about him to the French history of the different leagues of ancient republics. He asked him to send them to him, stated, "I really need those books," towards the end of the letter. And at the very end, it's the very last line of the letter, added as a nota bene, "Forget not to send your remarks and the books requested." So what it suggests is that the leagues were maybe not necessary, but that they were felt as necessary by some delegates. So we cannot be as absolute as what Bernard Bailyn said, I think. Christopher Gore here considered that he could not do his job properly to examine this new federal system without studying those ancient leagues. Now I'm reaching my conclusion. I hope I still have time to do so. To state that the small neo-Greek confederal movement of the 1770s and 1780s has contributed to enable the American founders to set up the first large federal republic, this more perfect union on the ruins of the ancient confederations. The neoclassical references to the Greek leagues are obviously chronological. They mirror the chronological evolution of the creation of the American Republic from generic and loyal and monarchical references to specific and monarchical references in the mid-1770s, then from enthusiastic and optimistic patriotic references in the second half of the 70s to pessimistic and federalist references in the 1780s. The Greek leagues were far more useful in this venture than what James Wilson and Bernard Bailyn claimed. More than illustrative subjects of curiosity, they were used by the Federalists and by the anti-Federalists alike to expose and oppose competing visions of federalism. The Federalist rhetoric, often presented as consistent in retrospect, was not always coherent, far from it. It even displayed insufficiencies or contradictions, which failed to answer some anti-federalist arguments, so that the quantitative domination of the anti-federalists by the federalists regarding those leagues should not be exaggerated. It should be balanced by a qualitative study of those references. And this quasi-monopoly of the Federalists could be explained by the rhetorical usefulness of the leagues. So the neoclassical references may not have been determinative, but they were not just illustrative. They could be more useful than some modern references or than British experience on certain points like republicanism or federalism. In some cases, the precedents referred to by the founders were exclusively ancient, like proportional representation in Lycia. Some Americans referred to those leagues paradoxically to support their arguments in spite of their criticisms regarding their lack of usefulness. Some Americans manipulated them, and ancient experience was even felt as necessary by some founders like Christopher Gore. Now, other historiographical conclusions or suggestions could be that neo-Roman exceptionalism was first British, or at least also had British origins, that there was that the study of the Greek leagues enables us to identify a neoclassical enthusiasm or optimism regarding the Confederation in the second half of the 1770s, and that the anti-federalists contradicted, same word, had fewer contradictions than the major federalists. Now, I would like to finish on a point regarding historical databases. I am and we are dependent upon the research tools of databases in many respects, and this research fellowship has given me an interesting opportunity to complete my research in American newspapers. I have found new results, new occurrences. Now, it has also enabled me to compare some keyword searches made 10 years ago with the same keyword searches in 2022. And I have discovered that I have lost hits. In other words, many hits that came up in 2011 in the America's historical newspapers do not appear anymore. They are not, at least automatically, found by the search engine. You can find them manually, but not automatically, which implies that if I had started working on this subject now, since it's primarily the references of the 1770s, I would not have been able to say most of what I have said today, and the Americans would still not be referring to the Greek leagues until the drafting and ratification of the Constitution teleologically. So it poses many questions regarding the reliability of those databases. One of those questions has to do with, let's say, has to do with the methodology. And one criterion to assess the reliability of the keyword searches is to assess the proportion of false hits in order to put things in perspective. For example,
we really need to finish up because we're out of time for questions, and I really just want to say goodbye.
Thank you very much. Yes.
And I would, though, say that Thomas Ricks recently did it was aimed at a popular audience, a book called First Principles, what the founding fathers learned from the ancient Greeks and Romans. And he makes the argument there that they're actually not terribly interested in the Greeks, though specifically largely talking about Romans, with the exception of Jefferson. So one of the things you've done here is to give a corrective that this talk was basically all about Greek influence, but I think he raised an interesting question about Greek versus Roman influence. On the whole, it is generally true. They more often mention the Romans. And you made the famous quote from Bailyn that these texts were more illustrative rather than prescriptive or determinative. What you've, of course, he was thinking about political thought, and by looking at specific models and structures, rather than just the history of ideas, you've, I think, raised an important qualification to that. And I would just finish, because we really are out of time, it's on the hour, but by thanking you and also saying that, of course, the influence of the Greeks and Romans was felt in everywhere. And Bailyn wanted to make the case that the real influence was country Whigs in England. And that was a strong argument. Obviously, Americans didn't particularly want to credit their ideas to the British, but where did the country Whig guy get their ideas from? And a lot of these ideas, even some of the most famous ideas, the Enlightenment, really represent a repetition of Greek and Roman ideas, and especially the Greeks, who in many ways were the most innovative. So that's just the thought to leave you with. Thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste. That was very good. And as I said, I ended up by making notes. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Andrew.